He laughed as the car pulled away, like abandoning me in a foreign country was just another punchline. The tires of the rental car kicked up dust as it disappeared around the bend, leaving behind a stunned silence. And me. I stood motionless outside the small cafe, my mouth still half open from the argument, blinking at the empty road where my husband had just been. Daniel's voice still echoed in my ears. "You're always so clever, Isabella. Figure it out." Then laughter, his and his friends, Liam clapping him on the back, Connor joking. "Guess we'll see how long she lasts." I clutched my phone. I called Daniel first, straight to voicemail. Then Liam, blocked. Connor, blocked. Every one of them. My hands shook as I scrolled. The panic was rising fast, like a tidal wave crashing before I could build a wall. This isn't real. This can't be real. The sun blazed above the red-tiled roofs of the quaint Italian town, its charm suddenly suffocating. It was early June, the height of tourist season, but everyone around me seemed to melt into shadows. A couple sipping espresso a few tables over glanced at me with mild concern, then turned away. No one spoke English. No one moved to help. I walked, aimless, every breath shallow. The cobblestone streets twisted and narrowed, leading me to a dusty side alley where I finally collapsed onto a bench, breathless, stunned. My purse, my passport, my wallet. I checked. I still had my passport, thank God. But my credit cards? Gone. Daniel had offered to carry them earlier. To keep things safe, he said. I'd handed them over without a thought, like everything else. I counted the cash I had left. 80 euros and a few wrinkled dollars. Not enough for a hotel, let alone a plane ticket. I laughed, short and bitter. How had I become this woman? A woman who gave up her career in interior design to support her husband's rising architecture firm. A woman who moved across cities, adapted to Daniel's lifestyle, social circles, his version of what a wife should be. I used to think Daniel's control was love. Now I knew it was a leash, and he'd just let go. By nightfall, I'd found a tiny pension above a bakery. The room was dim. The bed creaked with every shift, and a sink sat in the corner like an afterthought. The old woman at the front desk didn't speak a word of English, but when I handed her 60 euros in cash, she nodded and handed me a key. I didn't sleep. I lay on the narrow bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, my phone beside me, screen dark. 26 missed calls made to Daniel, all ignored. I stared at my wedding ring under the dim lamp, platinum, 2-carat diamond, a gift on our 5th anniversary. I remembered how proud he looked when he slid it onto my hand. Now it just felt like a shackle. Sometime past midnight, the heat unbearable, I got up and stood by the tiny window. The street below was silent. No cars, no footsteps, just the hum of the city sleeping. I thought about calling my sister, my old friend Sarah, even my former boss. But then I imagined their voices. "You left your whole life for this guy?" "We told you." Number I couldn't. Not yet. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I pawned the ring. The man behind the counter barely looked at me before quoting a price that made my stomach clench. "It's worth 3 times that," I argued. He shrugged. "You want cash or no?" I nodded. The money was sweaty in my hand. Not freedom, but maybe the first thread of it. Back at the bus station, I stood in front of the glowing schedule board, clutching my bag. Destinations blinked in unfamiliar names. Florence, Venice, Rome, Naples. None of them felt far enough. "Where you go?" the clerk asked, looking bored. I paused. My heart was beating strangely calm. "Greece," I whispered. "Anywhere coastal, as far as your buses go." He raised an eyebrow but began tapping the keyboard. Behind me, the station bustled with noise and life. Tourists arriving, lovers parting, locals shouting into cell phones. But in that moment, all I heard was the silence between Daniel's laughter and the sound of the car door slamming shut. I held on to that silence like a lifeline, because it was the moment something broke, and maybe, just maybe, something new began. I collapsed beneath a silver-leafed tree and woke up to a woman speaking Greek, handing me water. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The light was too bright, the air too fragrant with salt and crushed herbs. My lips cracked as I tried to speak, but all that came out was a rasp. The woman crouched beside me was older, her skin sun-darkened and lined from years of work and weather. Her eyes were sharp but kind, and when she repeated her words, her tone was soft, coaxing. I didn't understand what she said, but I understood what she meant. She helped me sit up and pressed a tin canteen to my lips. The water was cool and metallic, and I drank greedily, tears mixing with the sweat on my cheeks. "Maria," she said, pointing to herself. I blinked, nodded slowly. "Isabella?" She smiled and patted my cheek. Then she pointed up the hill to a stone farmhouse nestled between olive groves and distant glimpses of the sea. I had no strength to argue. My legs wobbled when I tried to stand, so Maria looped her arm under mine and guided me up the dusty path. It felt like a scene from another life, one where strangers extended kindness without agenda, and I was allowed to accept it. The farmhouse smelled of rosemary and wood smoke. Inside, it was cool and dim, filled with worn furniture and the sound of cicadas humming beyond the shutters. Maria led me to a small room with whitewashed walls and a narrow bed covered by a hand-stitched quilt. I sank into the mattress and fell asleep with my shoes still on. The next 3 days blurred together. I woke up to the sound of birds, the smell of baking bread, the gentle clink of pottery in the kitchen. Maria brought me simple meals, bread, olives, tangy goat cheese, and let me sleep. She never asked questions, never pushed. On the second morning, I found a folded bundle at the foot of my bed, a faded cotton dress and a pair of sandals. When I emerged into the kitchen wearing them, Maria beamed and poured me a cup of strong, gritty coffee. She gestured for me to sit, then pulled out a small notebook and began teaching me words in Greek. Nero for water, kalimera for good morning, efkaristo for thank you. I repeated them clumsily. She corrected me gently. There was no judgment in her eyes, only patience. Theo appeared on the third afternoon. Tall, quiet, his silver-streaked hair tied back at the nape of his neck. He entered without a word, wiped his hands on a rag, and nodded once at me before disappearing into the grove behind the house. Maria called him her husband, but they moved around each other more like dance partners than spouses, comfortable, wordless, balanced. I stayed mostly silent. I didn't know what to say. Grief and shame hung over me like damp laundry. The memories of Daniel, of the cafe, of the laughter, pressed in during quiet moments, threatening to drown me. But here, surrounded by olive trees and silence, there was a strange kind of safety. One afternoon, Maria motioned for me to follow her to the living room. She opened a small wooden box and carefully removed a handful of photographs, sepia-toned, edges worn. She pointed to a younger version of herself, arm in arm with a smiling man who had Theo's eyes. "Sophia," she said, tapping a photo of a girl in her 20s. "My daughter." She mimed holding a baby, then shook her head slowly. "Gone?" I asked. Maria hesitated, then nodded. "Australia," she indicated with her hands. She pulled out a postcard with a picture of the Sydney Opera House, then a more recent photo. A toddler held in someone else's arms. She touched the image with reverence. "No, come back," she whispered. Her voice didn't break, but her eyes did. I reached across the table and took her hand. She squeezed mine tightly. That night, I found her in the kitchen, rolling dough for what smelled like lemon biscuits. I offered to help, but as soon as I touched the flour, my hands trembled. I blinked quickly, trying to push back the heat behind my eyes. Maria saw. She stepped closer, her hands still dusted with flour, and when I finally let out a strangled sob, she wrapped her arms around me without hesitation. It was the first time I had cried since Italy. Not the shallow tears I'd shed in that dingy pension or the bitter ones in the pawn shop. Real ones. From a place so deep I'd forgotten it was still there. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. She just held me until I stopped shaking. The next morning, she poured me coffee like nothing had changed, but when she turned to go, she paused and looked back. "Stay," she said simply. And for the first time since I was abandoned, For the first time since my world shattered like glass on stone, I didn't want to say no. The first olive I picked slipped through my fingers. The second one I caught. It was just past dawn, the sky still bruised with the last hints of night. Theo stood silently beside me, his silhouette framed by rows of olive trees that shimmered silver in the early light. He demonstrated again, long fingers curling gently around a branch, the practiced twist of the wrist, the calm drop into the wide net below. I mimicked him, clumsy. My fingers fumbled the stem, and the olive bounced off the net and rolled into the dust. I flushed, bracing for a correction, but Theo only nodded and moved to the next branch. I tried again. The second olive landed with a soft thunk. A small sound, but it filled me with something close to pride. The grove was quiet but alive. Birds chirped, insects buzzed, and the scent of wild thyme drifted on the wind. My arms ached quickly, my knees scratched from kneeling, and my hands, soft and pampered just weeks ago, were already raw. And still, I felt more grounded here than I ever had in the glass-walled home Daniel designed for us. He once told me, "Don't complicate things, Isabella. I need you focused on home." But this sweat, this ache, this work, this was my version of home now. By mid-morning, Theo handed me a wooden rake. We spread nets beneath a wide tree, and he demonstrated how to gently comb the branches so the olives fell like rain. I tried, sending down a cascade of twigs and more leaves than fruit. He chuckled quietly. "Too hard," he said, one of the few English phrases he'd mastered. I adjusted, watched, learned. That afternoon, Maria taught me how to light the outdoor stove. I flinched when the flame whooshed to life, earning a rare laugh from her. She handed me a bundle of chopped herbs and a chunk of goat cheese, then pointed to a worn recipe card. We made flatbread and a simple stew, everything fresh, everything real. I hadn't cooked without a microwave or an app in years. But when we sat on the porch to eat, I realized the meal I helped make tasted like satisfaction. The next morning, a new voice joined us in the grove. "New hands?" a woman called out in lilting English. She was short, sun-kissed, with wild curls under a bright scarf and a lopsided grin. "Daphne," she said, shaking my hand with strength that startled me. "Neighbor, gossiper, tomato thief, welcome." She made me laugh, and I didn't even realize how much I'd needed that. Daphne worked a neighboring plot and often stopped by with extra produce or sarcastic commentary. She teased Theo mercilessly, called Maria a herb witch, and dubbed me Boston. The nickname stuck. "You planning to stay, Boston?" she asked one day, leaning against the sorting table. "I don't know yet," I admitted. She shrugged. "That's fine. Olive trees are patient. They'll wait." That Saturday, we loaded the pickup truck with baskets of olive oil, soap, and preserves. Maria handed me a small mirror to fix my hair. I hesitated. "You go," she said. "Market is good." The village market spread across a cobbled square, vibrant with color and chatter. Vendors sold everything from lemons to hand-woven rugs. Our stall was simple: 2 wooden tables, a faded cloth, bottles of deep green oil catching the sun. I felt exposed, out of place, but Daphne was already behind the table, arranging soaps by scent and motioning for me to help. "Come on, Boston, this ain't the Met Gala." When the first customer stopped, I panicked. Oil?" "Very good," I offered, blushing. Daphne snorted. "Smooth." But over time, I got better. I learned to describe the oils in halting Greek, to smile when I didn't understand, to let the rhythm of the market carry me. When the day ended, Maria pressed a small envelope into my hand. "Your share," she said. I opened it. Just a few bills, but more than I'd held in my own name in years. Not Daniel's money. Mine. That night, after dinner, Maria and Theo sat me down at the kitchen table. Theo cleared his throat. "We want talk," he said slowly. Maria opened a folder and pulled out papers written in both Greek and English. "If you stay," she said, 3 years, work, 1/3 business is yours." I stared at them. They were offering me a future, not charity, not pity, a partnership. I don't know if I deserve, I began. Theo raised a hand. Work shows? We see. I nodded, heart pounding, but didn't answer. Later, in the quiet of my room, I pulled out the sketchbook I hadn't touched since Boston. It was buried at the bottom of my bag, the corners bent, pages yellowing. I opened it and stared at the blank page. Then, slowly, I began to draw. A redesign of our olive stall, a new layout for product display, labels, color palettes, a logo idea. Lines flowed from my fingers like they had in another life. Designer brain still lives, I whispered. I'd buried this part of me. Daniel said I didn't need it, that our life was fine the way it was, but here, under Greek stars, with olive oil on my sleeves and sunburn on my shoulders, I wanted it back. The sketchbook lay open beside me when my phone buzzed. I froze. It was an old contact, a name I hadn't seen in years. Hey, I heard you're alive. I might have a project for you. My heart leapt. Not fear, not dread. Hope. You can't run forever, Isabella. I'm flying in Thursday. Be ready to come home. The words flickered on my laptop screen, sharper than any blade. The email had arrived 5 minutes ago, time-stamped just after midnight, from a name I hadn't spoken aloud in weeks, though it had haunted every quiet moment. Daniel Walker. I stared at the message. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I didn't reply. My breath caught in my chest like I'd forgotten how to exhale. He'd found me, not because he missed me, not because he regretted what he'd done, but because, like always, he couldn't bear the idea of not being in control. It had been a slow, drowsy afternoon on the farm. The olive trees shimmered under the still sun, the cicadas loud enough to drown out thought. I'd spent the day bottling oil with Maria, labeling each one carefully with the new designs I'd sketched. That night, after dinner, I sat on the narrow bed in my room. The air smelled of rosemary and salt. My laptop, barely functioning, buzzed with effort as I connected to the patchy Wi-Fi Maria and Theo's grandson had installed years ago. I was only checking emails. I wasn't expecting a threat disguised as nostalgia. From Daniel.Walker@warchestgroup.com. Subject, I know where you are. Message, it's taken months and a very expensive investigator, but I finally tracked you to that backwater grove in Greece. This has gone on long enough. I'm flying in Thursday. I'll pick you up from wherever you're staying. Be ready to come home. Pack lightly. We'll talk on the plane. Don't make this harder than it has to be. D. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I miss you. Not, are you okay? Just orders. As if I were a stray dog that wandered off and needed retrieving. I closed the laptop with shaking hands. Outside, the wind had died. The trees were motionless. Even the insects had gone quiet. For a long time, I sat there staring at the wall. The old me would have panicked, packed a bag, disappeared again before he could arrive. But I wasn't that woman anymore. Maria found me in the kitchen, my coffee untouched. You look pale, she said gently, brushing a strand of hair from my forehead. Something bad? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I opened the drawer beside the oven and pulled out the envelope I'd been meaning to give her. Inside, the partnership contract. 1/3 ownership of the business, legal, translated, signed. I handed it to her with both hands. Maria looked confused at first, then scanned the documents slowly. She reached the signature page. Her eyes lifted to mine. You stay? She asked. I nodded. I stay. She didn't smile. Not yet. Instead, she reached across the table and took my hands. This is home now, yes? Yes. We both exhaled at the same time. The next morning I called Sophia. She was a contact of Daphne's, a lawyer based in Athens, fluent in both Greek and English, and terrifying in her calm professionalism. When she picked up, I introduced myself. I need help, I said. My husband is coming. I want to be ready. Divorce? She asked, no hesitation. Yes. And I want to protect what I've built here. Sophia didn't ask for backstory. She didn't need it. I emailed her my marriage certificate, the property agreement with Maria and Theo, and the limited financial records Daniel hadn't locked me out of yet. She sent me back a draft within hours, divorce papers, with a preliminary asset request. "You don't need to win everything," Sophia wrote. "Just enough to prove you're no longer silent." That evening, I stood in front of the mirror in my room, brushing my hair into a low braid. My face looked different. Not prettier, not softer, but sharper. More defined, like something that had been hidden too long was finally stepping into the light. I opened my nightstand drawer and slid in 2 envelopes. One, the signed partnership papers. The other, the divorce documents, ready for Daniel. "Let him come," I said to the reflection. My voice didn't shake. I turned off the light. At dawn the next day, the farm was still. I poured coffee, tied my boots, and headed to the press room to sort samples with Theo. We worked in comfortable silence, the air thick with the scent of olives and sun-dried wood. Around noon, we heard the rumble. Theo looked up sharply. He walked to the door and shaded his eyes. Down the dirt road, a silver sedan kicked up dust, polished, out of place, familiar. Theo turned to me, his voice low. "Visitor." "This place has changed you," he said, disgusted. I smiled. "Exactly." The silver sedan crunched over gravel and came to a halt near the olive press shed. Daniel stepped out like he'd just landed at a luxury resort, pressed chinos, expensive sunglasses, shirt collar crisp despite the summer heat. He looked around, clearly unimpressed. His gaze swept the stone farmhouse, the rows of trees, the dirt under his shoes. Then he saw me. I stood by the open door of the press room, wiping my hands on a cloth streaked with olive oil and dust. My hair was pulled back into a braid, my skin sun-browned, my shirt damp from work. He stared, eyebrows drawn together, unable to reconcile the version of me before him with the woman he thought he knew. "Isabella?" "Yes," I said. "Still me. Just edited." He took a few steps closer, lips curling. "You look rough." I shrugged. "I work." Daniel scoffed. "Right. So this is where you've been? Hiding out on some geriatric farm, playing farmer's wife?" "Working partner," I corrected calmly. "Co-owner, actually." He laughed once, sharp and mean. "Come on, Isa. This isn't you. You hate manual labor. You cried when we had to assemble IKEA furniture." "That was a long time ago," I said. "And I didn't cry. I just didn't want to be married to someone who read the instructions out loud like it was a hostage negotiation." He narrowed his eyes. "Don't be cute." I didn't flinch. Behind me, Maria and Theo had stepped out from the house. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. They stood there like bookends of a life I'd chosen. Silent, but solid. Daniel looked past me to them, then back at me. "You've gone native. Great. But this little detour is over. Pack your things. We have a flight to catch. I've booked business class." "I'm not going anywhere." His jaw clenched. "Don't be dramatic. You made your point, whatever that was. Let's go home. We can fix this." I reached into my satchel and pulled out a thin folder. I handed it to him. He opened it, confused. His eyes scanned the first few pages. "What is this?" "Legal partnership," I said. "1/3 ownership of the olive business here. Signed, notarized, filed." He looked up sharply. "Are you kidding me?" "No." I reached into my bag again and handed him a second envelope. "And that's our divorce paperwork. Drafted by Sophia Drakos. Licensed in both Greece and Massachusetts. You'll find provisions for an even split of assets, excluding anything you tried to hide through your firm's shell accounts." He paled. "You've been talking to lawyers?" I folded my arms. "Yes, while you were busy hiring private investigators." He flipped through the documents, each page adding color to his face. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "You have no idea what you're doing." "Actually," I said, stepping closer, "I do." I held up my hands, rough, calloused, stained from oil and sun. These hands built something. For the first time in years, I wake up knowing I matter. Not because I manage your calendar or keep your clients entertained, but because I do real work, and people here see me. He laughed bitterly. "People? You mean these peasants?" Behind me, Maria walked forward. Without a word, she pressed a single piece of paper into my hand. The original partnership agreement, with her and Theo's signatures, mine beneath theirs. "You belong here," she said simply. Daniel watched, stunned. "You left me in a foreign town like luggage you forgot," I said, voice low but firm. "You don't get to collect me now like I'm something you misplaced. You're throwing everything away." "No," I said. "I'm choosing something better." His nostrils flared. "You'll come crawling back. When this little fantasy dries up, when your hands hurt, when the glamour fades, you'll remember what you gave up." I shook my head slowly. "You're the one crawling now." For a moment, he looked as if he might strike me. His hand twitched. But then he saw Theo step forward, silent and unblinking, and he stopped himself. He gathered the papers with trembling fingers, shoved them back into the envelope, and turned toward his car. "This isn't over," he muttered. But it was. The engine started, the dust kicked up, and just like that, he was gone. I stood still, breathing slowly, watching the road long after the car had disappeared. Theo walked over and put a hand on my shoulder. Maria stood beside him, her expression unreadable. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to, because in that sunlit moment, surrounded by groves older than any of our wounds, I knew he would never understand what I had gained here. But I did. I used to be Daniel Walker's wife. Now, I'm just me. And that's more than enough. The sky over the Peloponnes shimmered in soft amber as I arrived at the Saturday market, my breath visible in the early autumn air. The leaves had begun to turn, just a whisper of gold on the olive trees, the kind of change you only noticed when you'd truly rooted yourself long enough to see the seasons shift. Our booth stood near the center square, right under the hanging banners of this month's harvest theme. The hand-painted sign above us read, "Callus Grove, Oils, Soaps, Roots." I'd designed it myself. Daphne was already there, adjusting baskets of olives and fussing with jars of preserved lemons. "Boston," she called out, grinning. "You're late. I've already haggled with a German tourist and scared off 2 teenage boys who thought our soap was edible. I trust you with both diplomacy and aggression," I smiled, tying my apron. "Thanks for opening up." "You're the boss now," she winked. "I'm just here for the olives and gossip." By mid-morning, the market was buzzing. I moved easily between customers, switching between English and my still imperfect Greek. Maria had been drilling me for weeks. Product descriptions, phrases for food pairings, jokes to charm even the grumpiest grandfathers. Behind the booth, Theo handled the heavy lifting, occasionally nodding at returning customers who now treated us like family. He wasn't much for words, but his hands, steady and work-worn, said everything. At noon, I checked my phone. A single email lit up the screen. The subject line was short. Signed. It was from Sophia. I opened it slowly, even though I already knew. "The divorce is final." He signed. "You're free." I exhaled, not because I'd been holding my breath, but because the air felt different now. Not heavy with fear or uncertainty. Just still. I slid the phone back into my pocket and turned to help an older woman pick out 2 bottles of the spicy olive oil blend we'd developed last season. Later that day, while reorganizing the display table, Daphne handed me a thin envelope with a wax seal. "This came for you," she said, handing it over like it contained secrets from another world. Inside was a formal invitation, an olive branch pressed into the card beside it. "We are honored to invite Isabella Walker of Callus Grove to speak at the Mediterranean Agricultural Exchange this October. Suggested topic, from abandoned to rooted." My fingers trembled only slightly. I smiled. That evening, we returned home to the scent of fresh bread and the low hum of pressing machines ready for the next olive harvest. This year's yield had been generous. Maria said she hadn't seen the branches so full in over a decade. She and I stood in the press room, the last light of day streaming through the windows. I traced a finger along the edge of one of the empty bottles, imagining how it would look with the new autumn labels. "I'm not healing anymore," I said quietly. Maria looked up from sorting the nets. "I'm blooming." She didn't reply, just walked over, kissed my forehead, and pressed a jar of herb salve into my hand. The same kind she gave me months ago when my hands were blistered and trembling. Still good for city hands, she smiled. We both laughed. After dinner, I returned to my room. The space was no longer just a guest room, it was mine. My clothes hung in the wardrobe Theo had repaired. My sketchbook rested on the bedside table, pages worn from ideas and redesigns. In the kitchen, I'd repurposed an old drawer pull into a towel hook. It used to be my wedding ring. Now, it held linens instead of promises. The next morning at the market, a little girl with dark braids wandered over to our booth, tugging on my sleeve. "Are you Greek or American?" she asked. I knelt beside her, smiling. "I'm just home." He left her in a foreign country, thinking humiliation would keep her small. Instead, it became the soil where her strength took root. Justice doesn't always arrive in a courtroom. It sometimes grows quietly in olive groves, in calloused hands, in the unshakable decision to begin again. When control collapses and truth is no longer afraid, the one who walked away becomes the one left behind, because no man who abandons you gets to decide where your story ends.